5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker and rise today to speak in support of this very important common sense legislation, the Government Funding Transparency Act 2008. I'd like to thank, of course, Chairman Towns for his work on the subcommittee, Chairman Waxman for his early and active support on this legislation, and especially to Ranking Member and former Chairman Mr. Davis, who we were able to work directly together over the past days and weeks to make this, as he states, I think a much stronger bill and one that answers many of the concerns that were raised by Mr. Davis, his office, and members of the minority of the committee. Mr. Speaker, as described, the Government Funding Transparency Act will require that companies that receive more than 80% of their income in annual gross revenue from the federal government and who have more than $25 million worth of federal work in any given fiscal year disclose the salaries of their most highly compensated employees. This disclosure would be, as Representative Davis noted, posted on an existing OMB website, www.usa.spending.gov, which was authorized as part of the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, a bipartisan measure passed by the 109th Congress. As pointed out in a recent GAO report, buying services accounted for 60% of the total 2006 procurement dollars, and expenditures on security services due to our engagement in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have forced those service expenditures to increase substantially. In addition, according to that same website, we have seen an increasing number of contracts that weren't competed at all. In fact, in 2000, the amount of contracts not competed was 48 billion, just north of there. And in 2007, 7 years later, that number had ballooned to 112 billion. And yet, with a substantial increase in government funding going to companies through no-bid processes, that are virtually, these companies are virtually subsidiaries of the United States government, taking in 80 to 90, perhaps 100% of their revenues from U.S. taxpayers. We don't know enough about these companies. We don't know their management practices, their financial statements, or their employment policies. They are often highly and tightly held secrets, not subject to public scrutiny. And so, not surprisingly, as Chairman Waxman mentioned, in October 2007, when the full Oversight and Government Reform Committee brought the CEO of Blackwater before us, one of the largest government contractors, taking in nearly 90% of their revenue from federal contracts. The CEO of that company, Eric Prince, refused to disclose to Congress the amount of profit that that company makes or the amount of the salary that he took in. Yet, despite the fact that 90% of that salary, 90% of the company's revenues come from the United States taxpayers. It's our money. We deserve to know how it's being used. Regardless of your position on this war or any other war, we deserve to know whether or not public funds are being used to unjustly enrich government contractors. But this principle, as Representative Davis and others, shouldn't just be applied to these of private security or service contracts. It should be required of all entities that make the vast amount of their earnings, over 80% from U.S. taxpayer dollars. And I especially like to thank Representative Davis and also Representative Fox for their advocacy for this principle. Importantly, it's important to note that this bill will actually only affect a limited number of companies, only those entities that subsist almost entirely on federal money, and only those that are not publicly traded, since public companies who do the lion's share, frankly, of federal contracting already disclose executive compensation information. Mr. Speaker, profit is clearly a powerful motive, and this legislation does nothing to remove this incentive from our federal contracting structure. But when it comes to private companies like Blackwater and others that would not exist if it wasn't for United States taxpayer dollars, the taxpayers in this Congress should have the information necessary to decide whether we've gone too far in padding the personal pockets of those who feed at the government trough. As the late Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and I believe that this legislation will apply a little bit more sunlight to the federal funding process. Again, I thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for their assistance on this legislation, and I know that this body will agree that as stewards of the people's treasure, we must do everything in our power to ensure that it is being spent justly and responsibly. Again, I thank the Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.